שיחה מוקלטת עם דוקטור פרלצוויג, מוריס פרלצוויג, ניו יורק, יום ב' ט"ז בשבט, י"ז בשבט, תשמ"ג, ה-31 בינואר 1983. Let me ask you the first question about your relationship with Spain did start earlier than your activity with Cardenas.
Yes.
And you told me about your crossing with Nahum Goldman into Spain in late 39 and early 41. That was a non-Jewish episode to a certain extent. But do you have any, previous to your contacts with Cardenas, did you have any official contacts with Spain or with any Spanish issue?
Yes, as I have told you, I went to see the Spanish ambassador in London before the war in order to secure his protection for the German Jews who were being attacked in Barcelona. At the time he told me, of course, as I expected, that the government was against all that and that he would send a message to the government drawing attention to the fact that these attacks on the Jews in Barcelona, who happened to be German refugees, were causing great concern to Jews in England.
That was the Republican ambassador?
Yes, that was the Republican. As I told you, I can't now recall his name. This must have been about 1930, certainly after 1936, when I became responsible for these things for the World Jewish Congress, and before the war broke out. So it was in the late 30s that I went to see him. The name that seems to float about in my mind is Ascarati, but as I already said, I can't be sure about that. At any rate, he was the Spanish ambassador. He received me officially, and I drew his attention to these incidents in Barcelona. He undertook to secure from his government measures that would protect the rights of these Jews. That was the only, the first, and I think up to that point, the only contact I had with any Spanish official.
Did you, at that time and prior to your arriving in New York, have any contact whatsoever with any country in Latin America?
No, no. Prior to my coming to New York, I didn't have any contact with Latin America, except for one indirect contact, which is now, in hindsight, interesting. The British government had come to the conclusion that the Nazis were at that time, I'm talking now about the late 30s, and in fact after the war had begun, were trying to secure control of Uruguay. And they had the idea that there was one man, or at any rate it was suggested to them by one of their Jewish employees, that there was one man who could deal with the situation, and that was Nahum Goldman. So they sent this man, whose name I can now give you without making any trouble because he's long been dead. His name was Phineas Horowitz, and he was an officer of the Zionist Federation in England, who felt very strongly about Hitler and had volunteered his services to some branch of the British Secret Service, according to which he was to appear on platforms in Hyde Park and elsewhere and denounce the Nazis. So they knew about him, and I think as far as his relation with them, as far as I knew, was concerned, his relations with them were perfectly proper. He didn't, at that period, at any rate, undertake any espionage or anything of that sort. He was simply a propagandist against Nazis, whom they employed in the hope of getting public opinion, at least of those people who went to meetings in Hyde Park and places like that, to feel that the Nazis were a serious business. Now this man must have suggested to them that Goldman was a man who could really do something about Uruguay. So he came to me and he told me this, and he said,
You mean Goldman?
No, this man Horowitz came to me and said to me that he had learnt that Goldman was going to America. This was before we both went, on one of his journeys to America, and that his ship, which I think was an American ship, would be docking in Cork in Ireland. And he, Horowitz, was prepared, if I would give him a letter to Goldman, to go to Cork and see whether he could persuade Goldman to go to Latin America, or at any rate to Uruguay, in order to counter this move of the Nazis. Well, I thought the thing over, and I didn't much like having anything to do with any underground organization, and I didn't have anything to do with them then at that point. I did later on. They came to me about America after I returned to America, but that was sometime later. I wrote him a letter. I wrote a letter to Goldman and said, this letter will be delivered to you by Phineas Horowitz in Cork when you dock there, and I would be grateful if you would consider what he has to say. Well, what actually happened was that Horowitz went to Cork and tried to get on board this boat in order to deliver the letter. He actually didn't succeed because of the war atmosphere and so on. They prevented anybody from boarding the boat who wasn't a passenger. And one of the results of the whole episode was that Horowitz was seized by the Irish police and searched, and they found the letter, as a result of which they took him to Dublin and put him in prison. It seemed, according to what Horowitz afterwards told me, that they were, the Irish police that is, were on friendly terms with the British Secret Service, and the British Secret Service, when they heard about it, decided to do what they could to get Horowitz out, which they succeeded in doing, apparently without any great difficulty. But I must add, he didn't seem to suffer anything. He told me that he spent most of the time in prison drinking whiskey with the guards, who were very friendly and apparently didn't resent the fact that anybody would be doing anything to stop the Nazis. But that was the first contact that I ever had with South America. I had never been there up to that point, and I had never dealt with them, except those delegates whom I saw at international meetings, with whom I had very friendly relations. But I didn't see them on their home ground.
Sure. Now, you left England and went to the States around 1940, 41?
40. My first visit to the States, the first time I'd ever been there, was on this, when I went with Nahum Goldman through Spain. This was my first actual contact with Spain, to Lisbon, and from Lisbon we were going to fly by, I think, what was then called the Flying Dutchman, to New York. But we were there several days, and we got a telegram from a man who died recently, who was at that period the political secretary of the Zionist organization, who had gone to America. Let's see now, what was his name? He was the ambassador in London of Israel in London at one time. He was a very well-known man who...
Linton?
Not Linton, no, not Linton. Definitely not Linton. This man was at one time I think the Secretary General of the Foreign Office. His name began with an L, I think. Arthur Lurie. Arthur Lurie, who had been the Secretary of the Zionist Executive, of which both Goldman and I were members, or more accurately, he was a member representing them in Geneva, and I was a deputy member who was for all intents and purposes a member of the executive because I had a vote in political affairs. He sent us a telegram to say that he had gone this way by aeroplane and that they had landed in the Azores and that they'd been staying there for 3 days, and he advised us to take a ship. So we took a ship. We went onto a ship which was an Italian boat, and I remember the incident very clearly because the American officer who was standing there insisted on vaccinating us. And he did it so thoroughly that I was knocked out for the whole of the journey. But we arrived very early in 1940. And we were met when we landed in New York by Stephen Wise and all the great men.
That was a short visit to the States.
No, it wasn't. I wouldn't call it a short visit. I stayed there 3 months.
Oh.
Perhaps I ought to tell you how it was that in wartime I was able to go to New York. What happened was...
It was still the phony war at the time.
No, it was the phony war, but it was still the war.
Right.
And there was still... there was a general prohibition about leaving the country, except with the government's consent. The reason I went, apart from the nature of the letter, I received a letter from Stephen Wise inviting me to come to America in order to enlighten the American Jews about the situation in Europe and the menace of Nazism, about which he said they apparently were very skeptical. And he told me what I was to do, what I was going to do. I would cross the whole country and speak about it at meetings which they would arrange, anywhere between Boston and San Francisco. And he thought that that would do a great deal of good. Apart from that, they wanted me, as well as Goldman, to speak at their annual convention, which took place in Washington in February. Remember that I arrived early in January. And there were other things that he specified that he wanted me to do, and he urged me at all costs to come, preach for him and all that kind of thing, and do a number of other things. And then after the typewritten letter, he had written in his own handwriting, in green ink, which is what he used, "If you come, you will do great things for England." Now, I had no idea what these great things might be, but the next time I went to the Foreign Office, in fact I was summoned by R.A. Butler, one of the things he said to me, "Why don't you accept Stephen Wise's invitation to go to America?" So I said, "How do you know about it?" He said, "I've got a copy of it in front of me as I'm speaking to you." And he showed it to me. The letter had been intercepted. That's how I know the war was fully on. And they had been much impressed by this statement of his that he had written, that I would do great things for England. And therefore they thought that I ought to go. I said to him I was very reluctant to go. I had a wife and 2 children, and I had a post as a rabbi, and I didn't know what this would mean. And he said, "Damn your wife and children. If you were a soldier at the front and were told to charge, you wouldn't say you had a wife and 2 children. This is in the interests of England." I said, "Well, I don't want to go as a representative of England. I'm not entitled to." He said, "No, your value to us is that you do not represent the government or anything to do with it, but you will be talking about your innermost feelings on the subject of Hitlerism, and we want the Americans to know about it." So I said, "Well, how am I to get there?" He said, "We will arrange for all that." So he told me to go to an address, I think it was in St. Anne's Road or something, where the passport office was. And the passport officer asked me what sort of passport I wanted. I was too innocent to ask for anything really grandiloquent, or for a foreign passport or anything, which I have no doubt would have been given to me, but I just asked for an ordinary British passport. So that was that. And as far as going there was concerned, I had already arranged with Goldman to go with him through Spain to Portugal and to fly from Lisbon to New York.
Now you told me about a very important passport which Goldman had in his hand, the Honduran.
Yes, Goldman had...
How long ago before that did he receive it? Or?
Oh, years before that, when he had a German passport, as you know, to begin with, and he did, I can't give you the dates, but he did manage to get it endorsed or at any rate extended by the then German Consul General in Jerusalem, who was a friend of his. That was years later, but after that he couldn't get it extended any further. So he discussed the situation with many people, and according to his own account, he was offered French citizenship by Bartou, who said that as he was foreign minister he could do it. And his answer was he didn't want French citizenship because if he were a French citizen he would be called to the army, and he wanted to work for Zionism. So Bartou suggested to him that Honduras was a country which would be willing to do it, and he did whatever was necessary to arrange for this shidduch between him and Honduras. So he had the passport for at least several years before we went through Spain, because I visited him in Geneva shortly after 1936, when we were both on the executive and working together, working on Romania. And he was there as the consul of Honduras, with the shield of Honduras in front.
Did he really have any functions? Did he give visas? Did they have any?
Well, he had the right to give visas, but apparently nobody ever came to Geneva to him to ask for visas. Mm-hmm. And he had instructions as to how to give the visas and so on. He was recognized by the League of Nations as the representative of Honduras, and in that way was able to attend the various meetings of the United Nations and have access to all sorts of things that were limited to diplomats. So he had this Honduran passport.
You know that Honduran visas were later a very big issue with Zilberstein and other, also the religious people got Honduran. Did Goldman have any practical relationship with Honduran real people, with the government?
Yes, the only that I know about, the only relationship was that he went periodically to Paris to consult with the minister of Honduras. But apart from that, as far as people going through Geneva were concerned, he appeared to have very little. Mm-hmm. And he never visited Honduras, neither when he had the passport nor afterwards, as far as I know. Sure. But he had the passport, and it turned out to be very important for him, not only because it enabled him to travel as he did to America, but the second time that he went after this, when the last ship, American ship, which collected American citizens to America from Europe, he was admitted because he had a Latin American passport. And that's how he got out of Europe. Mm. I think
that was late in 41.
Yes. Mm. That was the occasion when I talked to you about the letter which was delivered to him from me on the ship from Phineas Horowitz. But it was very important because the ship was stopped at sea by a German submarine. It was an American ship, and they boarded the ship, but the captain wouldn't allow them to see the passengers because they were looking for refugees and others.
Mm-hmm.
And if it hadn't been for his Honduran passport, that might have been the end of it. So it was very important, both from the Zionist point of view, because it gave him access to people on the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations, and in various other ways, and it was very important from his own point of view.
Sure. Now, so you went to United States, and you stayed here something between February and...
No, I stayed until the end of March.
End of March.
I returned on the Conde de Savoia with Goldman on this Italian boat. Nothing of any importance happened then, except that at Gibraltar, the British boarded the boat and took off the German refugees who, for reasons of their own, were returning to Europe. I mean, which again illustrates the famous saying that it's difficult to be a Jew. Why anybody should want to leave from America to Europe in 1940, I don't know, but there may have been very important personal reasons which you can easily imagine. But that was the only incident that happened, and we both landed in Naples without any difficulty at all from the Italians. And then I went from Naples to Rome, to the Swiss consulate, and as I've already told you, I was asked on the form which I filled in what my religion was, and when I protested, the man at the desk said, if you had been a German Jew, we would have refused you the visa. Which drew a strange contrast between what had happened when I entered Spain and what was going to happen when I entered Switzerland. And I think that Jews in general have rather given more credit to Switzerland than it deserves in its treatment of refugees early in the war. Sure. And may have improved later on. But there are witnesses of it, abundant witnesses, and I've mentioned one, and that was Friedlander, Saul Friedlander, who himself witnessed some of the things that happened.
Sure. Now, but why, on your way to Great Britain, should you go to Switzerland, coming from Rome? Right?
Well, for one thing, I was traveling with Goldman, and he insisted on going on an Italian boat because Italy was still neutral. And secondly, I wanted to consult in Switzerland with the other people in the office of the World Jewish Congress.
Which was still at the time in Geneva.
Yes, at that time it was more important than ever because France had been, the headquarters had been closed. And I had been appointed at the time in a telegram which I received in London before I went on the journey as head of a new office in London for the which was to be called the European Office of the World Jewish Congress. And so I wanted to consult with the people, and besides which it was much easier so far as journeying was concerned. There were no the boats going to England were very few, and it was a short flight from Geneva to London, so I went that way.
Mm-hmm. So you went back later to Great Britain. Was there in Great Britain something like a British section of the World Jewish Congress?
Yes, yes.
And separate of it, the European office of the World Jewish Congress?
No, the European office was a new thing which was set up, and I was made the head of it as a result of the closing of the office in Paris, which had been the headquarters. Mm. Geneva, there was an office, and it remained there. but the headquarters had been in Paris. When the Germans came into Paris, they transferred the headquarters to London. Now, the British section, of which I was the chairman at the time, had been established shortly after the founding conference, which was held in Geneva in August 1936. There were two elected people at the conference, at the 1936 Geneva Conference of the World Jewish Congress. I was one. I was elected to the executive, which was a small body of 7 or 8 or 9 people. And there was a much larger body called the Administrative Committee, and the English member of that was Noah Baru, who afterwards played a leading part in the German reparations business. In fact, many people regard him as the real author of it. And I think Goldman did too, because he didn't believe in it at the beginning before Baru was able to give him material on which he could make up his mind. So there was a British section, and I returned and acted as chairman, and my principal duty was to go to foreign governments represented in London at the time, which were a great many, and to establish contact with the Free French, which I did. I saw de Gaulle and had interesting conversation with him, which had a practical result, because when the moment arrived, which he thought and I thought was opportune, he issued a declaration on the Jews, which was printed in the papers which were sent out by him. And also, of course, I retained my connections with the British government, which turned out to be, in some respects, quite important.
So such an important position in Great Britain, how come you moved later to the United States?
Well, because this was the decision of my superiors, namely Wise and Goldman. There were very important people in Britain. The president of the British section was the Marchioness of Reading, Eva Reading, who had access to the Foreign Office and very often went. And when I left the second time, and I knew it would be a long time, I suggested to both the person concerned and to the executive, the person to succeed me would be Sidney Silverman, who was a member of Parliament and very well known and quite influential, which is what actually happened.
When was it?
This was 1941.
Before or after June?
Oh, it was after June. It was after June. It was somewhere about September or October.
But before Pearl Harbor?
Yes, well before Pearl Harbor. America was a neutral country, and this was part of the point about it. What happened was that my visit to America had deeply impressed various British officials. I wrote a report about it, which I gave them, and the report surprised some of them. For example, that the British were not well thought of by a good many Americans. For example, I quoted a member of the Supreme Court whom I saw, who was Brandeis. And when I told him about what both Weizmann and I were hoping to influence people in America to send munitions and arms and airplanes, Weizmann particularly interested in airplanes, to Britain, his exact words to me were, "The best that I can say about Britain, about the British, is that they are not as bad as the Nazis."
And he was not a Zionist.
Well,
in the revisionist sense of the word.
Yes, he was a man who was deeply interested in Palestine.
Sure.
I didn't tell you, and I may be of interest from the point of view of the Hebrew University, one of the places I went to in my first visit in 1940 was the British Office of Information. I remained in touch with all the British officials. Some of the consuls presided at the meetings at which I spoke. I did the best I could in accordance with Wise's view of the matter, back up the Allied side. And they had the disadvantage because the Germans were very strong and the British were very weak. And one of the places I went to where they showed me their papers was the British Office of Information. And they showed me reports that they had sent to England about the views of various sections of the American population. There was one on the Christians. What they said about the Protestants and the Catholics was not of present importance. I mean, the Irish Catholics were anti-British, and the Lutherans were pro-German and so on, and the Anglicans were pro-British, which you'd expect. What was interesting, what they said about the Jews. They said about the Jews they were not so much concerned about Hitler. They wanted Jerusalem.
They wanted?
Jerusalem. Those are the exact words which I remember. And I remember saying to the man who died a few years ago, where do you get this information from? He said, do you read the Jewish press? He said, yes. We read the New York Times, which they assumed reflected the views of the Jewish community because the owners were Jews. Mm-hmm. I said, do you read the Yiddish press, which then had a circulation of 1 million? They said, no, of course not. We can't read Yiddish. And one of the things that I did was to arrange for the American Jewish Congress to give them a weekly summary of the Yiddish press, which was compiled by a well-known Yiddish poet at the time, which I think made a difference. Because what happened was that the New York Times did not report all the things about Hitlerism, which might have been reported because they didn't know. But they did report what shlichim from Palestine said, who came to America to object to the British White Paper of 1939. So the balance of the information was what really worried the Jews was the future in Palestine. And Hitler, they objected to, but he took a second place. Mm-hmm. This happened during the first. And then, of course, there were very large meetings of people in the various places I went to, Boston, Detroit, everywhere to San Francisco. I was advertised as a man who had been in London during the bombing, which was true, and that I was going to describe the bombing. So a lot of people turned up, and the British consul was quite often in the chair, and they sent reports back. There was a man, for example, in Chicago, whose name was Bernays, British Consul General, who was a descendant of the famous Haim Bernays, who had been in Hamburg, I think, in the 18th century. He was, by this time, completely assimilated, a Christian, and a relative of the Freuds, of Sigmund Freud, who was very interested in what I was doing and felt a certain relationship with the Jewish faith, who in particular wrote passionately that I should be induced to go back. Mm-hmm. So when you asked me, when holding the important position that I did, why I did it, although various people were not in favor of it, the fact is that a great deal of British pressure was brought to bear on me to go back because of what the consuls said, and the consuls were biased. But one of the things I did in England was to draw attention to the loss in salary which they'd suffered by the drop in the pound. And they were living sometimes under difficulties. And I think that helped, especially when I discussed it with Lord Halifax, to restructure their position. And also Bernays, in particular, whom I've mentioned, drew my attention to the fact that there was next door to him an enormous building with 12 or 13 floors filled with German officials conducting German propaganda, and the British had virtually nothing except what the consuls could do on their own. So the consular officials were very anxious that I should come back, and there were even people in the embassy. And this was brought home to me by various people. And I happened in the cabinet as it then existed to have a very close friend called Arthur Greenwood. There was a period in the history of the labour movement in which I was the chairman of a body which I think no longer exists, called the University Labour Federation of Great Britain. It was an important body because the universities in those days returned members of Parliament. And therefore the University Labour Federation had a certain political significance. All its members afterwards, except myself, became members of Parliament. I was the first chairman. The first treasurer was Malcolm MacDonald. The first secretary was Kenneth Lindsay. But at any rate, my relation with MacDonald, for example, turned out to be quite useful, especially at the meeting in 1939, of the Jews and the Arabs and the British, where he was the colonial secretary and one of the chief representatives of the British government. So a great deal of pressure was brought to bear on me, although I was reluctant to go because of my wife and children.
Which you remained back in London?
Yes. And I only had a visitor's visa anyhow. But what happened in America was that visitors' visas, a year after I arrived, were accepted as more or less not exactly permanent, but not subject to deportation.
Now, when you arrived in New York, in the office of the World Jewish Congress, there were a lot of people there. There was Tartakover, and there was Baruch Zuckerman, and there were, I mean, the whole list. I know them now from your correspondence. How did you slice out the work, and what exactly were your functions?
Well, there was one man you haven't mentioned, Kubovitsky, who became Kubovi.
But he came a little bit later. He came through Spain. And
well, that's what I was going to say. And your interest in Spain, I mean, he apparently, without serious difficulty, was able to come through Spain.
He came from Belgium.
Belgium. His place of his nationality was Belgium. He came from Eastern Europe originally, but he had a Belgian passport, and he went through Spain and got to America. There were what you might call portfolios. My portfolio was international affairs. We always called it international affairs because for tax and other purposes it was all right. Now, Tartakova, who died recently, was in charge of...
Tartakova passed away?
Yes, didn't you know that?
No, I did not. I knew he was very bad, but I didn't know.
No, about a couple of weeks ago.
Yes?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
It was actually, I saw it first in the New York Times, the obituary, and I've since seen it in the Jewish Chronicle. Tartakova had relief. There were various, it was structured in the way in which the Zionist organization was structured. Each man had a portfolio, a given section of the work of the Congress. That's how it was done. Then there was also set up in 1941 the Institute of Jewish Affairs, which was very important, under Jacob Robinson, together with his brother Nehemiah Robinson and 4 or 5 other people whose function was research and who issued publications of one kind or another about the situation in Europe or the Jewish situation generally. That's how it was done. And I was told that when I found that I was more or less permanent, I went to the British Embassy and said, I can't remain here, and my wife and children aren't there. So what happened was that when Lord Halifax came on a cruiser, or whatever it was, battleship, to America, the place that he and his suite had on a ship which was going from Glasgow, the name of which I've forgotten now, it was a very well-known name at the time, was vacant. So they sent a signal and they put my wife and children on that ship, and they traveled to Canada. The ship came to Montreal. And then I had to arrange for them to come to New York. It was a little bit difficult, but there was one way in which I acquired immigration status which I hadn't anticipated. I went to the State Department, whom I knew quite well at the time, and who were very friendly to me because I was a source of information to them about the earlier history of Zionism and its relations with the British government. For example, they were particularly interested in St. John Philby, whom I knew and whom I had debated in London. I had no idea about what his son was going to do, but they were fascinated by Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And Weizmann used to see them regularly. And on one occasion, some of the things that he said, which I thought were damaging, I persuaded them not to publish in their collection of documents which they put out from South Carolina. He says when he came to America, he's coming to the State Department because he had no one else. The American Zionist leadership was very poor, and they didn't have any idea what it was all about, and so on. Well, I didn't want that published. And it was signed by 2 people who were present at the conversation. And there was a friend that I had, and a Goldman had, who drew my attention to it. And I got it put out not because I provided arguments that convinced them, but because I told them I was a pupil of George Macaulay Trevelyan, who was the great historian in Cambridge, who was professor of history when I was there. And I used to go to his lectures, and I very often see him. Of course, they used to reverence anything from Oxford or Cambridge, or especially Trevelyan. Anyhow, that's how it was. The thing, we divided the various tasks, and we each came and reported to the committee, of which, a sort of office committee, of which Kubovitsky, who became Secretary General.
Did you have regular meetings?
Yes.
On a weekly basis?
Well, I can't tell you what the dates were. It's a long time ago. After all, we're talking now 40 years ago.
40 years, exactly.
And but we had very frequent meetings, both of the people in the office, which was in the office of the American Jewish Congress, and larger meetings of the bodies which were affiliated to us. Well, actually we had, at that period, and I'm almost ashamed to admit it, only one real affiliate, which was the American Jewish Congress, although they brought along with them their affiliates, which included all the Zionist organizations. I mean, Coalition, Mizrahi, and so on.
But the smaller nuclear, the more intimate, was it, were these formal meetings with a procès-verbal, with a protocol, with a...
Well, I don't know about the protocol. I think there were protocols produced from time to time. There were people who made reports of these meetings and circulated them abroad and so on. But I don't know whether the thing was as regular as it ought to have been, as you suggested, as it ought to have been. That I don't remember. I don't remember getting copies of the...
I have a list of some people which I wonder what their functions were. For instance, James Wise.
Well, at a
James
certain
Waterman
point
Wise.
arrived, and this was years later, when we became interested in the Soviet Union, when it entered the war.
But that was before you arrived. It entered the war in June 41. And possibly the...
I mean, when June, no, it can't be. I mean, I'm not talking about that. It was after the Germans attacked. Was that 41?
That was June 41.
Well, then
You must have arrived in America between the attack on Russia and Pearl Harbor.
I was in America before the attack on Russia, because I know when the attack took place. I was speaking to a meeting of Jewish war veterans in Atlanta, in the Atlantic City. And the news came through. And the man sitting next to me got up and spoke and uttered these strange words. Doesn't matter what has happened. We will not support a country as wicked as Soviet Union. I mean, when I heard the news, my blood ran faster because I knew we had a chance of winning a war. I know I was there. So if you say it was June, are you sure it was June?
21st of June, 41.
When did they go into, they went into Poland in September of the previous year, of 1940, is that right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
so that's right. Well, then I was wrong when I thought it was September, but in the end I must have been there. I was there, I'm sure I was there. I thought it was later in the year, but my memory is evidently 40 on that. But I was there when they attacked Russia. And it was at that point that we got interested in making some contact with the Russians, who were, as it were, co-belligerents. And we did that. Emanuel Newman, who was a member of the Zionist Executive, and I was sent on behalf of the Zionist Executive and the World Jewish Congress to interview the Soviet ambassador, Konstantin Umansky. We had no difficulty in arranging the interview. And we had a long and interesting interview. Now, this wasn't early in the attack on Russia. It came later. I think it was 1943. And I am full of it because somewhere I have written, I'll tell you where in a moment, an account of this interview. In the Institute of Jewish Affairs in London, they found a letter which I had written to Lord Halifax after I saw Umansky. In the letter I didn't say anything very much. I said, I saw Ambassador Umansky yesterday or today, or whatever it was. And his views about American Jews were very different from yours. Halifax thought American Jews were inclined to be pro-Soviet, which is quite untrue, but I mean, there were some, like Sholemash and others, who spoke in that kind of language, and the Jewish communists were very active. His views were very different. His views were that the Jews were anti-Soviet and pro-Ally. And what's his name, the Russian expert there, Horomensky, I've forgotten his name, asked me what happened. Years later, in the 70s. So I said, give me a typist and I'll dictate it. This was 40 years later. No, 40 years, isn't it? And I dictated it. And my memory for things that happened 40 years ago is very good.
It's wonderful, I must tell you.
Remember
all the names and all the colors.
I told, one of the things I did at this interview was to try and persuade Umansky to get the Soviet government to release Jews who were being held in prison. One was the old rabbi, what was his name, Mordecai Nurok. You remember Mordecai Nurok? He was afterwards a member of the government. He was being held in prison in Moscow because he was a member of the Actions Committee of the Zionist Organization. And he said what to me turned out to be a terrible thing. He said, come back with a list. And we'll see, I'll see what I can do. And you can imagine in the office when I came back and sat down with Robinson, who knew the situation better than anybody else, it was like Yom Kippur, Unis Anatokov, you see. Mm-hmm. Who's to live and who's to die? He says, don't make the list too big. Anyhow, I dictated an account of the interview, and the man at the Jewish Institute decided that my memory was faulty, because when we were talking about Nurok, he asked me, where was Nurok born? Umansky asked me. So I said, I think he was born in Riga. And he said, which side of the Curzon line is that? Now, by great good fortune, I knew what the Curzon line was. And I said, I think it's on our side of the Curzon line. He said, no, it's on our side. My friend in London who saw this decided that who knew what the Curzon line was, decided the Curzon line was not on Umansky's side, but on our side. And he said, an ambassador can't make a mistake like that, saying the wrong thing. Therefore, the whole interview, the whole story, must be treated with great suspicion. And he was about to write to me to say he couldn't use it, when he came across a paper which had not been disclosed up to that moment, written by Emanuel Newman, who had written an account of the interview, which he had sent to Stephen Wise and no one else. And this mass of Stephen Wise papers came to the Institute in London, and they saw Emanuel Newman's account, and it tallied exactly with mine.
And that's all the time.
And so they printed it. It was printed in the 70s, I don't know, in a thing called Soviet Jewry. I mean, what was interesting were two things. I won't go into all the details. What was interesting was that when I said to him at the end, Mr. Ambassador, if you do this thing, if you secure the release of these people, world Jewry will be grateful to you. To which he answered, what do you mean by world Jewry? Don't I belong to world Jewry? That was first anybody knew that Umansky was a Jew. The other thing was this: as we were going, I had my hands on the doorknob of the door. He said, "Gentlemen, the question of Palestine will come up at the peace conference." Everybody was talking about peace conference. We'll have a word to say about that. We turned round, but he wouldn't say anything more. So they were thinking of. These are the two, apart from the details that we discussed with. Well, that meant we had access to the Soviet embassy. At least
You mean
had.
James Waterman Wise?
No. Then afterwards.
Since then.
Wait a minute. No, after that, it was decided that we should back up if there was a fund for the Soviet Union, that we should back it up. When I say we, I mean the American Jewish Congress wasn't the World Jewish Congress. And President Roosevelt, decided there should be a Russian relief fund, and he asked a man called Winthrop Aldrich, who was one of the chief financial people, to be the head of it. And Winthrop Aldrich first refused it, what having to do with the Russians. But at any rate, he wasn't going to have any dealings with the Russians. He finally succeeded. And as I had by then become an active worker in the British War Relief Fund, he sent a message to me, would I go to Umansky and ask him what they were prepared to do to facilitate the Russian War Relief Fund. And I went. I dealt with Umansky on behalf of certain Americans. Umansky at first objected to the expression War Relief Fund. He said, in Russia there's no such thing as relief. The government fills in all camps. But in the end, he gave way. And we began to raise money. And when then, not only we, but people in general, there was a Russian War Relief Fund. At that point, Stephen Wise wanted his son, James Waterman Wise, to participate in this. So he was appointed as a sort of assistant to me in Washington. And I left the Russian business to him.
You were stationed all the time in New York?
Yes.
And still conducting international
I
affairs?
went every week to Washington, at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. If I had to go to an embassy or wherever it was, I went to Washington. I went early in the morning, came back at night, and had the various interviews which I had. Waterman Wise had nothing to do with the rest of the business. He was confined to the Russian business, and they liked it because, I want to tell you something about his past which you should know. When the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was signed, and I saw Stephen Wise, he said to me, this will be a terrible thing, this Ribbentrop-Molotov business, but it has given me back my son. Now, that's a rather interesting thing. He had been very pro-communist, and he remained. I don't know, I think he's still alive in the south of France. He became very wealthy. And at a certain point during the McCarthy business, he left the country because it was too dangerous for him. And he's mentioned in several books as being one of the Red Decade, as one man calls it. But he was interested in Russians, and I don't think he was too careful about what he agreed to. He was the go-between. So, for example, if they had film business to setting up films which were described as being put into lorries and sent out to the battlefield so that the soldiers would see these films, I had a very strong suspicion that the films were used for other purposes elsewhere. But I didn't bother about it. I mean, I knew that whatever arrangements were made, the Russians would take no notice of it. By that time I had experience. So Waterman Wise was there because he was his father's son, and because he was deeply interested in this business of Russian war relief. So he was appointed as an additional person to be in Washington more frequently than I was.
There was another lady by the name of Evelyn Dworkin. She also figures as an employee who is taking care.
She was an employee, she was in the clerical part. The only other employee who came to us after a long delay through Mexico was Knopfmacher, whom you mentioned in a footnote.
While she went through Spain.
Yes.
And
yes. She wrote to, you say, Goldman, without specifying Nachum. And in fact, one N instead of two. So I don't know whether you knew it was Nachum Goldman, but the letter you quote, or you cite, was written by Knopfmacher to...
she was from Luxembourg, or from Belgium also.
No. Knopfmacher was a Viennese.
From Vienna?
Yeah.
But did she come straight from Vienna?
No. She was in Geneva when the war broke out. She was a member of our office. She was the administrative secretary, which is a title which we invented. She wasn't a real secretary. She was one of Goldman's numerous female friends. And she was in charge of the office in Geneva for many years. But she came originally from Vienna.
Why did she leave Geneva to go as a refugee or possibly
because she was afraid the Germans were surrounding Switzerland. And they were all afraid that the Germans would descend on Switzerland.
Because she went, they had quite a hard time, she and her husband.
Yeah.
She went through Spain, Portugal, and they ended, if I'm not mistaken, Curacao. Before they came to Mexico, where she was stationed for about 2 years or so.
Yes, well, we couldn't get her. I didn't know about Curacao. I think there wasn't a visa required for Curacao. That I've read somewhere. Then she went to Mexico, and it took us a great deal of effort to get I'll tell you the story, effort on the part of Juarez, who was a very powerful man in America, to get her a visa to the United States. Now, the reason for that was that when she saw the American consul in Lisbon, or wherever it was, that she tried to get, she boasted about the achievements of the Congress, and the particular case she talked about most was Romania. Now, in Romania, there are a number of things, striking things happened before the war. One was we presented a petition at the League of Nations, which was received and studied. Now, this is where Goldman's difficult position came in. He didn't sign the petition because he was trying to get the Romanian and the Pole on the Permanent Mandates Commission to back up the Zionist demand. Therefore, he couldn't attack Romania. So what happened was that he remained in Geneva, and he telephoned first to me in London, and then to Mark Yarblum in Paris. I went to the Foreign Office, and Yarblum went to the Quai d'Orsay. This was the strength of the World Jewish Congress. When you talk to an individual government, it's difficult to move it. But if you talk to several governments, one or other will agree with you and will approach the other governments, you see. What happened as a result of our intervention was that the French and the British began to discuss it. Well, one of the things that happened as a result of the row which we raised following this petition, which is not signed by Goldman, Goldman, who was in Geneva, although he was, I think, chairman of one of the committees at the time, was signed by Jahrblum, who came from Paris for the purpose. And then I was told to go to Geneva in order to conduct the public relations, which I did. I remember going in to the press office, and the young woman there, who was British, I've forgotten her name, it was a Scotch name, I think it was Stewart. She said to me, Dr. Perlzweig, you're not a journalist, because I came with a with a credential from the site of London. You're not a journalist, you're a rabbi, you can't lead this double life. So I said to her, Miss Stewart, it's because I'm a rabbi that I can be trusted to lead a double life. Anyhow, I was admitting she had no answer to that. And I confronted the various journalists there and told them the story. Well, one result was that the Romanian government fell. There was a man called Goga, Octavian Goga, who was the Prime Minister of Romania, quite forgotten now. But he was a Nazi of the most extreme kind. I told the Foreign Office, it's in one of the documents, where it's reported in one of the documents that has now been released, that he was worse than the Nazis. It wasn't an exact description of what I said to the Foreign Office. I said to them that if the Nazis didn't allow Jews to employ women under 40, he made it 45. He always went one better, you see. Anyhow, he left the King's Chamber and was confronted by journalists, and the only thing he would say was, Israel, thou hast prevailed. In other words, he resigned. There wasn't much of an improvement after that because I think the king appointed the patriarch. But they did appoint this man, Calinescu. This story is told by Varga, and I don't have to repeat it except that she boasted about all this, how I went to Romania and saw the Prime Minister and various things happened. And when what I chiefly said to the Prime Minister, I mean, I more or less told him in polite language he wasn't telling me the truth. It was really look, if I tell you, there was a man, he went to Israel later, I don't know whether he's still alive now, I'm just trying to think of what his name was, who accompanied me to the palace of the Prime Minister. He was a lawyer, Kramer. When we knocked at the door was half open and a hand came out and got me by the lapel of my coat and pulled me in. And the door banged, he was left outside. They had orders that I was coming, but not that he was coming. And there was nothing for him to do. So I got accustomed to the rather dim light. And a man pointed in a uniform to a length of carpet, and I walked up this length of carpet up to a flight of steps, and walked up this flight of steps. And every so often, 2 or 3 times before I was on the second floor, there was a man dressed in a uniform that looked like a field marshal who raised his hand in the fascist salute. So I replied to it by taking my hat off. I didn't want to fascist until I was finally shown into an antechamber and began the process for which Goldman had a word, namely antichambrieren, waiting for Prime Minister. And the man began to talk to me, who was sitting in the room, in French. So he said, what do you think of our country? I said, oh, very beautiful, and so on. What do you think of our women? Oh, I said, yes, they're very attractive. He said, well, then why don't you come more often? I said, well, it's a long way to go. I have to go to, I don't know where. I said I had to go to Geneva, and then from there to take the train across Yugoslavia to Bucharest. He said, but you can fly across. I said, no, I can't. The plane flies across Germany. And as I'm a Jew, I don't want to fly across Germany. And when I said that, he tried to say something, but he couldn't. His lips fluttered. He became a little bit pale. That a man in Romania, and this was really one of the principal purposes of this visit, in the antechamber of the Prime Minister said he was a Jew and therefore wouldn't do certain things, completely upset this man. And he didn't say, he handed me a newspaper. It was Le Matin, I think, of not the present one, the one published then in Paris, and I read it until I was summoned to see the Prime Minister. And when I was ushered in, I saw this little man. He was a little man who was called Caranescu and had been educated in France, which made us hope that he was more democratic. He sat at the end of a very long room behind a desk, so that I had quite a long walk, which is apparently one of the methods used by dictators generally. And he ran out from behind the desk and ran with both hands stretched out to me and said, "Mon cher rabbin, I've been looking forward to this visit." And then I had this long talk with him, which...
That sounds quite Latin.
Hmm?
That sounds quite Latin mentality, I mean.
Yes. Yeah, oh no, it was French was spoken quite frequently in Romania. Of course, I didn't speak Romanian. Anyhow, he'd been brought up in France, where I had I think the most remarkable thing was that I talked to him about a place called Chernauty, which used to be called Chernowitz, where they had promulgated a regulation that all the shops were to be open on Saturday, even those who closed on Sunday. Or even those who were open on Saturday, the Jews were open on Sunday and closed on Saturday. He said all shops must be open. Well, this of course was a great blow to the very Orthodox community which lived there. And I said that this is... So he said to me, he said, if anybody gave this order, he will certainly be disciplined. I will take a note of it and see that it's rectified. I said, well, what was so strange about it was that he was the one who gave the order, you see. So the conversation that took place between us then really could be boiled down to this. I knew that he wasn't telling me the truth. He knew that I knew that he wasn't telling me the truth. And yet, in a very Romanian fashion, we went on talking to it. And then he said, to end up, that he would see a number of leading Jews whose names I mentioned to him. Dr. Friedman, I remember, was one of them. And have not that he would see, he didn't say that. He said to me that I was to see these people and tell them what he had said. So I said I wouldn't see them. I said they are Romanian citizens and they have a right of access to their government. And you ought to see them. And he agreed. Well, we weren't satisfied with all that. And this is the point of where Goldman showed his skill. He, as I said, telephoned to me and to Jan. He said we were to go to our foreign offices and invoke the minority treaties which were in force. We couldn't have... America didn't sign them, and therefore America was, although America helped in what way it could. So, but then I read one day in the newspaper that the British and French had intervened in Romania. They rang me up first and said, please don't let any journalist know that it was done at the request or the demand of the World Jewish Congress, because we want them to think that England wants this, not the Jews. Which I think was a good point. Anyhow, what I'm telling you is that Knopfmacher boasted about all this. And the American consul to whom she spoke was thoroughly frightened by this enormous power which he was admitting, and he wouldn't give her notice. It took us a couple of years before we could get a visa for her to come to New York.
She was stationed in Mexico meanwhile.
Yes, and she helped to build up some sort of organization in Mexico. She certainly did useful work there.
Did you know, and I'm sure you knew, Jacob Hellman?
Oh yes, I knew Jacob Hellman very well.
Something about him.
Well, it was we who arranged for him to go to the Argentina.
You met him in Geneva before,
Yes, I
36 and year before?
Not only that, but I went to Warsaw in 1939. Strange as it may sound. There was then going on a terrible public discussion about the Jews who were trying to leave Germany for Poland and weren't admitted, and were camped at Green Line, Zbonjin, the place was called. And the Poles, it will sound strange to you, I think it was either Hellman or somebody who went to Romania to telephone to me. Couldn't telephone from Poland. And the man they telephoned to was a leader of the Perlzweig, and I can only tell you at the moment that Ben-Gurion didn't like him and he didn't put him into the government. But
Zurbabel?
no, not Zurbabel. I mean, anybody could. He was. This fellow was a very intelligent man, whose wife was a poetess. Anyhow, what does it matter? He said to me, "You're the World Jewish Congress. Go to Poland and talk to the government about this particular thing." So what could I do? I said, I went and I had a talk with the Polish ambassador, Count Rosenberg or something, who was very sympathetic. He was very pro-British. And he said he would arrange for me to be received by the Foreign Office. So I went, I discussed it with Lord Reading, the husband of Lady Reading, who was with us. Now, he was, at the time, I think, Under Secretary of, no, he wasn't Under Secretary. He had been Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He had been a successor of Butler. But he was the chairman of the Council for German Jewry, which was the overall body that raised money and did things for German Jewry and carried on the fight. And I was a member of this council. So he said to me, "We won't let you go with nothing."
You what?
"We won't let you go with nothing." He said, "I'll go back to the office and I will see that you get a check for £20,000 in order to offer the Polish government to take the full expense of this act," which was a very fine thing to do, and shows you how desperate the situation was, that even a man like Reading, who was a very close friend of mine, I would say that. It wasn't only, it was partly personal friendship. And I all used to see him often. And he used to tell me not to worry his wife too much and so on. And one of the things that was very touching was that he said to me he hated any kind of ostentation or any kind of public flamboyance. And when she was about to be converted, and she told him, he begged me to let him know the day before so that he could leave the country and not have to read the newspapers about it the next day. So that was the kind of man he was, but he was very touched by this thing, and he worked very hard on many. You know, he was the council, represented the Jewish agency on various occasions. Anyhow, I went, and that's where I first saw Helm. There was a restaurant.
He was at the time one of the leaders of Perlzweig.
Yes, he was. There was a restaurant called Piccadilly, a name which I can't forget easily, where they used to meet. Hellman, Tartakova, and all these other people. and talk things out. And I went to the Piccadilly and saw him there and had a great deal to talk to him. Anyhow, we arranged for him to go to South America. And it was he who put the Congress on the map in Argentina. There's no question about that. He is still remembered, the people I've talked to in Argentina, with a great deal of affection. Of course, his son, as you know, is here.
Yes.
And is the secretary of the, or the executive vice president, they don't call him secretaries anymore, of the conference of presidents of leading Jewish organizations.
Yes. Let me ask you another question. When I look through the names, it looks like World Jewish Congress is actually Polish Jewish World, if you want.
Well, I'll tell you...
You're a British Jew,
yes,
but then...
no, I want to tell you that what I said in my oral history was, and I try to be very frank about it, when I looked round at the Congress in Geneva, I saw what it represented. It represented East European Jewry. Not only Zionists, it represented the Bund as well. I mean, the great historian Dubnov wasn't present, but he was elected the first honorary president. And his people, I talked to many of them, were represented. We had the smaller Jewish communities, like Italy, for instance. We had the Italian chief rabbi, Sacerdoci, with the consent of Mussolini, was present. But from America, we only had the American Jewish Congress. When I say only, we had some very important people. But we did have them, the philosopher who spoke to me, Horace, I've forgotten his name, but anyhow, we had some very important people, but in the case of France and England, and we had the juries of Latvia and Lithuania and so on, all the smaller juries, and we had Jews from Egypt, and we had Jews from North Africa, and we had quite a few communities in South America represented. There is, you ought to get hold of it if you can, it's very difficult.
I have got the list, and...
there was a protocol of the first meeting.
Yes, I have it.
Well,
and, from Latin America, it was just Argentina.
Yeah.
Brazil was represented by Yarblum.
Oh.
There was a young fellow, I believe, who happened to be in Geneva, and he was born or related to Chile, so he was both representative of Chile and of Peru.
Well,
and things like that.
I think you're right. I said then that what happened was, at that time, that we were really an outgrowth of the Délégation the Comité des Délégations Juives, behind which there were Western organizations, but which the impetus really came from East European. And that's what we represented. I was explaining what has happened since. Of course, now the whole thing has changed completely. Now it's really a tremendously powerful organization.
Yes, but we'd like to come to that point. When you came to New York,
Yeah.
unfortunately, Eastern Europe was not anymore on the map.
Yeah.
What really was left and was at that time being cultivated was Latin America.
Yes, well, Goldman and others went. You mentioned, what was his name, Ruba?
Tatakover went there, Zuckerman
worked very hard there. And we did manage to build. In fact, of course, before Congress went to its last stage, it was very strong. I went to Latin America I went to Costa Rica, I went to Bolivia, I went to Argentina several times, I went to Chile, I went to Peru.
During the war or after?
After.
After the war.
After. Peru, and I went to practically every country except, for some reason or other, neither Venezuela nor Colombia, but all the other countries. I went to Argentina and Brazil several times. And we had, just as we had Helman in South America, we had a man, his name escapes me, who we brought from Czechoslovakia to Brazil to build up the community, and he built up the present Confederation. We were working there all the time. When the Congress started, it was still not ready, but we were pushed into holding the meeting because of Hitler. It was obvious that you couldn't have world Jewry without anybody centrally coming to the League of Nations or whatever it was and speaking or attempting to do something. That was the impetus behind it. But as I've said, you one day, I'm sure you will get hold of this oral history, you will see that I frankly laid out. As a matter of fact, on several occasions, I myself was one of those that objected to this restricted arrangement. I met it in South Africa. I once went to South Africa and asked them to join the Congress. And they said, who in America belongs to it? I said, the American Jewish Congress. I said, it's not. Now, what we've succeeded in doing, and this is the work of Goldman, we've got this very powerful, financially powerful man, Bronfman, at the head of it, who's there because his father was. His father was a really good Jew, although he did many very odd things. But he was, I knew him very well. I don't know this man very well. We've got Bronfman, we've got treasurers and other people whom I don't know anymore. I very rarely go to the Congress. It's difficult for me to get about. But now we've got the Board of Deputies. What more do you want? We've got the B'nai B'rith is not affiliated, but it's present at all the meetings.
The Board of Deputies you didn't get before Brodetsky became the chairman?
No, we didn't even get it when Brodetsky was against the Congress all his life.
He was against the Congress?
There was a strong Zionist pull against the Congress. For example, when I went to Ben Gurion, and I said to him, look, the Zionist Congress passed a resolution in favor of the World Jewish Congress, unanimously. I'm going to be a member of the executive. I've been asked to be a member of the executive. I want to come to you, since I was then already in the other thing, to your consent. And he said, when the Zionist Congress passes a resolution unanimously, it is of no meaning or consequence. I mean, he meant to say that anything that's really serious is going to be discussed. This went through, nobody took any notes of it. He was, when I said to him, well, wouldn't you rather that I went to the Foreign Office and not the American Jewish Committee or the, oh, he says, there's no question about that. I'd much rather you go than the American Jewish Committee or the Anglo-Jewish Association. Of course, they were then both anti-Zionist. So I said, when I was offered the post, I said, I would only take it if Ben Gurion agreed. He was very anxious to get me into all kinds of things. He thought that I was going to do all sorts of things which I didn't do. And for example, when I was nominated for this being a deputy member of the executive, I went to him and said, what's this new job, BG, that you got for me? He says, not a job, it's a task. Well, that meant there was no salary attached to it. That was all that meant. I knew his language. But he was, it's perfectly true that this was, except for the Americans and for some people on the periphery, there was a certain number of French people who were interested in it, and there were ex-German refugees, like the man who had been the editor of the Vossische Zeitung.
Okay, Vossische Zeitung?
Yes. I'm just trying to think of his name. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. But I mean, he was, I remember him because he was the go-between with the Emperor of Ethiopia, who made a proposal to us that we should get him an airplane. And he would see that something in Germany was bombed, which he thought was, and we turned it down. Not because it was Menelik or what his name was, but because we were still in the days, in 1938, when the idea of killing people was wicked. We wouldn't have killed it if we could. Anyhow.
Okay, I suggest that we cut here.
Yeah.
We have really extended much more than I thought before. And to tell you also something more. I'm now working on the archives of the World Jewish Congress.
Yeah.
And I'm collecting small questions now.
Yeah.
An interviewer, I'll give you one example which we're not going to discuss now. The question of the Jewish refugees, which were treated as Nazis at the moment when Latin America did declare war or cut relationships with. That was in America, it was also abroad in Latin America. And might be some other items. And if you allow me to come back to you in a couple of weeks from now...
Look, the only trouble about that is I'm most anxious to see you. Because I want to unload before it's too late. I mean, I told you I'm 87. But the difficulty is that on the 14th of February I'm going abroad.
For how long?
For about until early in April.
Early in April.
I mean, I am...
Well, that's well with me, because I stay in the States till middle of May.
Oh, well, that's all right. Well, look, about the middle of April, get in touch with me.
Right.
I'm most anxious because I want to tell you